Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country. This episode of Native Bidaské is brought to you by the American Indian College Fund. Founded in 1989, the American Indian College Fund is the nation's largest Native-led and Native-serving charity dedicated to expanding access to higher education for American Indian and Alaska Native students. The College Fund provides scholarships and programmatic support to help students graduate and thrive in their chosen careers. It also supports 34 accredited tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, across the country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaské. I'm your host, Levi Rickert. The Brookings Institution released yesterday a new report on how Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill is cutting climate investments and weakening the safety net for Native Americans. With us today are two of the authors who wrote the report. He's no stranger to Native Bidaské, Rob Maxim from Brookings, and we have Glencora Haskins. So welcome to both of you to Native Bidaské. How are you two today?
Katapatash, Levi. Thank you. We're great. Appreciate you having us on the show.
And Glencora, why did you guys do this report?
When the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed last year, I think it was widely understood that it would impact Indian country, but even to date, there's been very little ability to quantify that impact. The legislation offers several carve-outs for Native American people throughout the bill, both for Medicaid work requirements, SNAP work requirements, and several of the Inflation Reduction Act programs that were repealed through the OBBA were left alone if they were set-asides for tribal citizens or Native people. All of that said, we know that the majority of funding that flows to Indian country does not come from these set-asides, or that exemptions to work requirements are always foolproof for ensuring that the people who they are designed to protect are actually receiving the benefits of these carve-outs. So we did this report because we wanted to offer one of the first looks at what the OBBA could really mean for Indian country and the impact that it could have on Native people living both on and off of Indian reservations.
Yes, and Rob, the report actually affixed a dollar amount, approximate dollar amount of $1.5 billion, and that's with a B, $1 billion, and that would impact the future green energy funding and what assumptions underpin projections contained with the IRA rates absent of the Big Beautiful Bill, and that really involves SNAP benefits. So how'd you arrive at that figure?
Yeah, and so there are a lot of bills getting thrown around, right? But the two that folks really need to know, the first is the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA.
Mm-hmm.
That was passed under President Biden, and it was the largest investment into climate change mitigation and green energy in U.S. history. And so the one we're talking about today, right, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the OBBBA, repealed portions of the Inflation Reduction Act with a pretty explicit focus on the climate change provisions there. And so what we were able to do was we were able to, using a data set called USA Spending, track the amount of funding that had gone to tribal entities, tribes, Native-owned entities, Native institutions like tribal colleges and others. And we were able to determine that about $2 billion in federal funding had already flowed to Indian country through these tribal entities as a result of programs in the Inflation Reduction Act that were then targeted for repeal. It's called rescission is the technical term, but programs that were targeted for repeal by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so what we did is we said, well, if these programs that are now being repealed were allowed to stay in effect through their expiration, and some of those programs would have expired in 2027, others would have extended though till 2031 and potentially after that. We found that if Indian country had been able to receive funding in those future years at the rates that they had received it over the last few years, it would have resulted in an additional $1.5 billion in funding going to tribal communities, citizens, and nations. But as it is, because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, many of those sources of funding are now going to be cut off entirely.
Well, that's pretty significant. And it looks like this is your report concentrated on those two areas of energy and green energy and SNAP and even some Medicaid, Medicare benefits. Largest sources of tribal funding come from non-tribal specific IRA programs. What lessons should Congress draw about future legislation when it comes to how they would structure investments for tribal communities?
I'm happy to offer a couple thoughts there, and then maybe Glencora can add on any thoughts that I miss here. The big one to me is that this cycle of investment and disinvestment that you see with these latest funding cuts is really representative of how Congress has done business with Indian country for, I'd say decades, if not centuries, right? The idea that we have these periods of flush funding that come in during certain administrations. Even then, I think many in Indian country would argue that there's still inadequate funding. Some periods are better than others. But then what happens is tribes and native-owned entities, they make investment decisions, long-term potentially investment decisions, based on what they understand to be the new federal landscape, and then it changes under the next administration. And so the federal government acts as an unreliable partner in many ways. And so we see that with bills like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You see that we talked about it in the context of the government shutdown and the fact that there are these discretionary appropriations bills that happen every year that can have wildly different numbers, sometimes zeroed out programs entirely, and folks don't really know what's going to be the case beforehand. And then last, we talk a lot about trust and treaty obligations and the fact that the federal government has a fiduciary interest to Indian country. But the way a lot of this funding ends up flowing to Indian country, and you saw this with many of the climate programs funded by the Inflation Reduction Act, you do see it too in programs like Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps, which are Native people are eligible for, but they're open to the US population as a whole. What we see is in many cases, the largest sources of funding to Indian country are either competitive, where Indian country and tribal entities need to compete against non-tribal entities, or they're things that the general population can access. And so what that means is when these bills are going through and these programs are made available, Indian country can get caught up in much broader political debates going on. And that's really, I think, violates the spirit, at least, and potentially the letter of many of these trust and treaty obligations. I don't know if Glencora would add anything else there.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that it's well known, I think in Washington and outside of the district, that the majority of funding that supports these trust and treaty obligations does not come for tribal specific programs or tribal set-asides. It comes from programs where there's broad eligibility, both for local and state governments, for which tribal nations are also eligible to compete. So one example, unrelated to the IRA, is food benefits. The majority of food benefits received by Native people and tribal citizens come through SNAP, not the food distribution program or program on Indian reservations. SNAP is obviously not a Native targeting program, but that is still the majority source for food support for food insecure Native Americans. Something similar is at play here, where the majority of climate funding authorized under the IRA that has supported and benefited tribal nations so far has not come from programs like tribal electrification. It has come from broad eligibility programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And so in the future, as Congress considers which programs it wants to continue to appropriate for or which programs it wants to cut, it's not sufficient to simply leave tribal serving programs on the books and decide that cutting other programs is not a detriment to Indian country. There needs to be a more thorough evaluation of these programs to truly identify who they're serving and what cutting them means for Native and non-Native people.
Yeah, and certainly to your point about SNAP during the shutdown last year, we did a lot of coverage of that, and I think Rob, you were on right around that time, and we were
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
that I think it's 1 in 4 Native Americans benefit from SNAP,
Yep.
and it's pretty significant. In as far as the area of energy, and I do think, and I think Rob, you mentioned it, the word political, right? I think sometimes tribes sometimes get caught up in the political shenanigans of Congress or the White House as they're working together. And, we're kind of like innocent bystanders, so to speak, because a lot of tribes did embrace the green energy legislation under the Biden administration. What advice would you give for tribal leaders in the future? And we do know in Washington, the pendulum swings one way and then goes back the other. And many of us are hoping it will swing back sooner than later. But what advice would you give tribes in the meantime, when they try to embrace some of the government programs that, unbeknownst to them, may be cut by Congress in the next by the White House?
Yeah, the thing I would say first and foremost is that I think many tribal leaders did a really good job of advocating for the interests of Indian country. And the reason I say that is you do see in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that many of the climate and energy programs that were allowed to stay on the books are the ones that are specifically benefiting Indian country. Things like Glencora mentioned, the tribal electrification program. That program is still in operation, as are several other programs specifically designated for Indian country. Now, the issue is that those programs don't have nearly enough funding to meet the total energy and electrification needs of Indian country. And so that's why a lot of tribes needed to turn to these other larger competitive programs to do the type of ambitious energy transformation work that they want to do on their lands and in their communities. So what I would say moving forward is one of the things that tribes can do is continue to advocate for the protection, but also the expansion of many of these existing tribal programs. And the good news is, I think on the Senate side, there are some allies in the Republican Party, members like Senator Lisa Murkowski, who chairs the Indian Affairs Committee, and who I think was pretty instrumental in protecting many of these tribal programs and getting many of the native carve-outs in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, who would support that. And, we've been in discussions with the Indian Affairs Committee in the past about the way that they fund tribal citizens, tribal nations, and tribal communities. And I think that there's more that can be done to say, hey, look, we all agree that these tribal serving programs are apolitical, they're in the service of trust and treaty obligations, and they're protected, and all the parties agreed on that. But now we need to do more to expand the funding going to these funding streams in the future and make sure that we can meet the full needs of Indian country.
This episode of Native Bidaské is brought to you by the American Indian College Fund. Founded in 1989, the American Indian College Fund is the nation's largest Native-led and Native-serving charity dedicated to expanding access to higher education for American Indian and Alaska Native students. The College Fund provides scholarships and programmatic support to help students graduate and thrive in their chosen careers. It also supports 34 accredited tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, across the country. Recently, the College Fund launched Because of You, a campaign honoring tribal college faculty, the heart of Native higher education. Because of You is an expression of gratitude for the dedication, passion, and presence of TCU faculty, and the many ways they support students every day. The centerpiece of this campaign is a powerful tribute told from students' perspectives that celebrates learning in community, preserving identity, and realizing dreams. To watch this video and support the American Indian College Fund's mission, visit www.collegeFund.org/becauseofyou.
Yes. Hey, let's talk about the potential loss of revenue for natives when it comes to the SNAP program. And part of it is tied to the identity and how states identify Native Americans, et cetera. And your report does a pretty good job of examining that. Let's talk about it. Glencora, what can you tell us?
Sure. So this has always been one of the harder measures to quantify because states are currently in the process of designing and rolling out their processes for implementing work requirements across SNAP and Medicaid. From historical context, we know that even when there are exemptions to these work requirements for certain groups, including households with children under a certain age, households with disabled working age adults, and Native Americans, there are difficulties in proving that exempt status when that bureaucracy increases. And that often leads to what we call procedural disenrollment, which means disenrollment from programs for which these individuals are eligible, but are disenrolled because of some administrative or clerical error, an inability to provide redetermination, or complexities in proving exempt status. We would anticipate that historical context will apply here. That despite efforts to exempt Native American people from these work requirements for both SNAP and Medicaid, that disenrollment will increase for these populations. And that is extremely dangerous to a population that has a higher eligibility for these programs than several other racial and ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Rob.
One thing I'd just add to what Glencora said, and I think it's important to kind of take a step back and understand the bigger picture here about why these work requirements for Medicaid and for SNAP matter so much in the context of the bill, but also for Indian country. So one of the most significant sources of cost savings in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act comes from these new work requirements for SNAP and for Medicaid. And why do we need these cost savings? It's because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act has pretty expansive tax cuts, right? Disproportionately aimed at higher income folks, but they do, affect folks across the income ladder. So in order to pay for those, they needed to offset them somehow. And the way that these cost savings are happening is that the bill counts on people getting kicked off their coverage. So if more people lose food stamps or more people lose Medicaid, then that means that the federal government doesn't need to spend money on those folks anymore. And so that's the structure at work here. I think it's really important to just name that and name that in terms of how the bill was designed, people losing health coverage and people losing nutrition assistance was a feature, not a bug. So I think that's just really important to put out into the conversation. And then the last thing I'll say is, crucially, as Glencora alluded to, Native Americans are served by both SNAP and Medicaid at some of the highest rates in the nation. So Indian country is particularly vulnerable to these policy changes. And as she said, there are specific provisions. And again, I think it's pretty safe to give Senator Murkowski, I think, some credit for this, that exempt Native Americans from those work requirements. But as we write in the piece, and as Glencora was alluding to, exempting someone on paper is not the same as exempting them in person. And there are a ton of bureaucratic hurdles that we can talk about if you want, that folks have to go through to prove Native identity in many cases. And that's where folks can accidentally get disenrolled, even if they are legally eligible to stay on the program.
Yeah, and I am really happy that your report really highlights this particular issue, because I have heard in the past from members of Congress that, well, we thought we solved that problem. They are exempt, but they don't know, if they don't dig deeper, as you guys have dug here, and they don't know. And I guess maybe to the viewers, if you encounter problems, you need to let your tribal leaders know, and tribal leaders, you need to let your congressmen know, or representatives, the senators know, because sometimes they do take the attitude. I've heard them at hearings say, well, we thought we covered that in this legislation, but they don't always understand. And I think the good ones, like I know Senator Murkowski is really on top of these types of things, but really how it's implemented and the lack of implementation in some cases. Could you comment on that, Rob?
Well, this goes back to something that I've actually talked about on the show before, around the fact that the challenge with policymaking for Indian country isn't necessarily a partisan Democrat versus Republican divide. The divide is between the lack of knowledge and the apathy that many policymakers have toward Indian country, and then those who do have a baseline or even hopefully deep knowledge of the issues facing tribal nations and Native people. And so this is the challenge here, is when folks haven't spent time in Indian country, when they don't know how programs work on the ground in Indian country, members of Congress can say, well, I thought we solved that program. But they don't know that, for example, if you want to enroll in Medicaid and improve your exemption, you might need a tribal ID. Well, let's say your tribal ID office is only open in person and you don't live close. I mean, this is an example with me in my personal life, right? When I wanted to get a tribal ID, I had to fly up to my tribe's reservation and make an appointment in person. And so that's a pretty prohibitive barrier if you're low income. And let's say you lose your coverage through some clerical error and you need to prove that you're Native to stay enrolled. If you have to make a trip, say potentially several hundred miles, maybe you can only go on a certain day of the week to get your ID renewed. Maybe it takes a little while for that ID to be produced. And then you have to send in all the forms. If you're missing 2, 4, 6, 8 more weeks of health insurance coverage or nutrition assistance, that's going to be a really critical issue for your family if you don't have health care or if you don't have food. And so these barriers, when you're a policymaker, 2 or 4 or 6 weeks might not seem like a big gap. But when you are a family trying to put food on the table for your kids, or when you are a patient going in for a procedure and you need to pay for it, that's a huge gap. And that's where I think the difference comes and some of the lack of understanding happens.
Yeah. Glencora, do you want to add anything to that?
I think the only other thing I'd add is that there are several infrastructure barriers that Congress is well aware of when it comes to the population writ large that it needs to consider when it comes to Indian country. So we think about rural populations, both Indian reservations and non, have lower access to broadband. Many homes do not have street addresses, connection to landlines for which to communicate with federal agencies or state agencies that can provide support on this are significantly reduced compared to the urban population. And so these are barriers that are acknowledged in several other components of federal policy that do not appear to be acknowledged here. The other thing I would just say is that if we are trying to inform policy moving forward, the federal government needs to invest more in data collection and assessment of the impact of its own policies. Going back to Medicaid unwinding in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which restarted procedural disenrollments for Medicaid enrollees, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare and Medicaid did not collect virtually any data on who was being disenrolled from the program over that time, particularly disaggregatable by race and ethnicity. Later, studies done by the Journal American Medical Association found that despite having one of the lowest populations in the survey sample, American Indian and Alaska Natives enrollees were significantly more likely to be disenrolled from Medicaid during the unwinding process, almost more than any other group. And so we know that this data can be extraordinarily helpful in guiding discussions about how to do this policy design. If the federal government doesn't invest in it, though, they can't use it as they design programs.
Yeah, and that is a ongoing problem, data collection, that we've talked about many times on Native Bidaské, but and it's all sectors, right? It's education, healthcare, USDA programs, et cetera, et cetera. It's an ongoing problem. And to our viewers, I would, if you don't have your tribal ID, and in Rob's case, he had to literally go, 600 miles or whatever away.
Okay, yeah.
And it's very difficult. And but to our viewers, figure it out. Get your tribal ID. Carry it with you every place you go, because especially in the age of ICE and Border Patrol, you need those IDs. But when it comes to benefits, you need them as well. And you guys, I just want to compliment you. You guys are doing fantastic work at Brookings, and this is for communities tribal communities that have been underrepresented throughout history. I just love the idea when I get your emails saying that, hey, we have a new report. I'm going, whoa, I can't wait to read it, because you guys do fine work. So I'm hats off to you. And so thank you very much. And any last words you guys want to say? I'll start with you, Glencora.
I don't have anything else at the moment. Rob?
All right, great. Rob?
Well, Levi, look, I appreciate what you said about our work. We feel the same way about everything you all are doing. You know, the native-focused journalism and the native-led journalism that you do is instrumental for us as researchers to understand what's going on in the world on a day-to-day basis. You know, the last thing I'd add is this is in some ways a trap of Congress's own making. And to the extent that we get out of it, the answer is we need to center funding for Indian country here. We need to enable tribes to be able to verify their own citizens, and we need to enhance and improve data sharing and data protection, uh, not just from tribes of the federal government, but the other way around. And there's not enough that we've done on that end. And so what we're doing with this bill is we're putting up a whole new set of bureaucratic hurdles that Indian country is going to need to face. And unfortunately, I don't think there are a ton of resources that are going to come with that to be able to navigate those new hurdles. So to the extent that folks that are in the policy space are listening, I think there needs to be some more thought in terms of the resources that go to Indian country to enable states and the federal government to verify and protect the rights and benefits of Native people. So I just think that's a really important message that those of us in Indian country need to keep echoing.
We've been talking with Glencora, Haskins, and Rob Maxim from the Brookings Institution. And thank you for your fine work. To our viewers, tune in next week for another edition of Native Bidaské. And in the meantime, elders take care of those young ones, and young ones take care of those elders. We are all in this together. We can get this done. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us. If you value our warrior journalism for Indian country, please consider supporting our work by scanning the QR code or visiting the link below. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and sign up for our free daily newsletter. Chimigwech.
This episode of Native Bidaské is brought to you by the American Indian College Fund. Founded in 1989, the American Indian College Fund is the nation's largest Native-led and Native-serving charity dedicated to expanding access to higher education for American Indian and Alaska Native students. The College Fund provides scholarships and programmatic support to help students graduate and thrive in their chosen careers. It also supports 34 accredited tribal colleges and universities, TCUs, across the country. Recently, the College Fund launched Because of You, a campaign honoring tribal college faculty, the heart of Native higher education. Because of You is an expression of gratitude for the dedication, passion, and presence of TCU faculty, and the many ways they support students every day. The centerpiece of this campaign is a powerful tribute told from students' perspectives that celebrates learning in community, preserving identity, and realizing dreams. To watch this video and support the American Indian College Fund's mission